Hello and welcome. Today we will talk about international pay systems, chapter 16 in the compensation textbook. Around the world, global competitive forces have changed the way people work and how they get paid. You're a part of this, and your pay is impacted not just by national forces, but by international and global forces that are operating in every single industry in all of our work environments. The globalization of businesses, financial markets, trade agreements, and even labor markets is affecting every workplace and every employment relationship. Employee compensation is central to the workplace and embedded in different political socioeconomic arrangements that are found around the world that you and I have seen on a personal level or study and maybe work with colleagues who come from different environments and therefore expect different compensation and benefit mixes in our organizations. So this topic is kind of a global guide to international compensation for you, although short, but we will cover some areas that you should at least be aware of. Understanding international compensation usually begins with recognizing variations or differences and similarities in figuring out how best to manage them. How people get paid around the world depends on variations in the factors in the global guide. The global guide basically concludes 4 general factors. That would be economic, institutional, organizational, and employee. And also each of these have sub-factors as well. 5 of the sub-factors are particularly relevant to the understanding of international compensation. That would be social contract, culture, trade unions and employee involvement, ownership in financial markets, and finally managerial autonomy in a given culture. The significance of all these factors in explaining international pay is very important to understand and to consider when you are designing your compensation packages that impact more than one country's citizens. The 3 general compensation strategies that we will talk about would be localizer, exporter, and globalizer. These are used by companies with worldwide operations, and they're important to understand, at least at a surface level. Overall, know that the issue of borderless pay systems allow managers to operate anywhere in the world nowadays, in a borderless manner. Overall, all around the world, know that competitive forces have changed the way people think about work, in the way they actually work, in the way they get paid. Japanese companies have dismantled their seniority-based pay systems and moved to merit-based pay. A company like Toshiba, for example, offers now stock awards, which was actually illegal in the previous decades in Japan. European companies have been shifting to variable pay and performance-based appraisal systems, which have been mostly common in the United States. China's employment system has experienced a fundamental transformation from a stable and permanent employment with good benefits, which were often called the iron rice bowl, to a system that is characterized by highly precarious employment with no benefits for about 40% of the Chinese population. Among the largest U.S. companies, about 3/4 of the new jobs in recent years were added not in the United States, but rather overseas. So sooner or later, you will be involved yourself in international assignments, or you'll be dealing with colleagues, employees that are working maybe outside of your location. For example, prior to Daimler's acquisition of Chrysler in 1998, the pay for the Chrysler CEO was equal to the combined total pay of top 10 Daimler executives. As little as 25% of Chrysler managers' total compensation was in the form of base pay, whereas Daimler managers' base pay accounted for up to 60% of their total compensation. The merged Daimler-Chrysler adopted a Chrysler-like approach to executive compensation because they saw that perhaps as being beneficial for them. Sometimes changes in pay are directly tied to sociopolitical changes, which is the case in China, in Russia, and even Eastern Europe, where government authorities had long dictated pay rates for all employees in each of these nations or countries. Now, companies in these countries do face the challenge of devising pay systems that are responsive to business and market pressures, while also trying to maintain a sense of social justice among the people, which is part of the culture or the conditioning of workers, because they were socialized perhaps with the older mindset that existed when the government operated more paternalistically. In China, the hope for profitability in many state-owned enterprises to cut the massively bloated headcounts. Yet an army of unemployed people without social support is a threat to government survival. So China may still be striving to become a workers' paradise, but the experimentation with compensation approaches might already qualify it as a pay pundit's paradise. However, too much change and experimentation can have a dark side that sometimes threatens to create social unrest. Following the breakup of the former Soviet Union or USSR, workers reported going sometimes unpaid for months. So it is time of unprecedented global change in some cases. Or is it? Well, historians conclude that globalization is neither unique nor irreversible. It has and can again sow seeds of its own destruction in a new workplace. In terms of the total pay model, keep in mind there are strategic choices. However, the pay systems differ around the globe. The total pay model used in our textbook on compensation guides our discussion of pay systems in different countries. The basic choices are objectives of the pay system, external competitiveness, internal alignment, employee contributions, and management. So, as the choices may be universal, the results are not necessarily universal. So you have to consider the environment, the culture, the country, the laws, in order to make a decision that's appropriate for each country operating in each different locality. Let us look at the global context. Understanding international compensation often begins with recognizing differences and similarities, while also figuring out how best to manage them. How people get paid around the world seems to depend on variations in their economics, institutional, organizational, and employee characteristics for each environment or each country. Organizations must first determine the degree to which each of these contextual factors constrain their competition, decisions, and practices in a given country. Some constraints are regulatory, for example, local laws, while others may be more normative based on the national culture or the social contract where people are working and operating at. In some cases, in terms of laws and regulations, there may be little room to exercise strategy. So you have to go with those norms. On the other hand, in the case of other contextual factors, the constraint may be less than often believed. So to be sure, there are differences on average between organizations depending on the country where the organization or the firm is actually operating in. However, there is also evidence that different management approaches are used within the same country at times. To the degree that strategy can be exercised, a company must decide the degree to which it will choose compensation practices similar to those used by other organizations and the degree to which it will be different. Being the same is perhaps less risky, but following the pack means that there is little chance to stand out and to differentiate yourself from the pack. So therefore, little chance to achieve anything better than the average performance. So there's less risk obviously involved with being very, very different from the pack. But also there are huge rewards associated with it as well. So in the international context, it is not always simple to follow the pack. Research indicates that multinational corporations are influenced by both the institutional pressures in their home country and the local context. Finally, the organization may actually weigh the home and local country context differently for different jobs. There are 5 contextual factors which are especially relevant in international compensation. These are variations in social contract, which include the legal framework and regulation, cultures, trade unions, ownership in financial markets, and finally, autonomy of the managers. So these 5 factors overlap and somewhat interact with each other. So let us talk about some of these contextual factors in compensation of international organizations or employees. Let us first start with the social contract. When viewed as part of the social contract, the employment relationship is more than just an exchange between a worker and his or her managers or employer. It includes the government, all enterprise owners, sometimes those who are acting individually and sometimes collectively through owner associations. And it includes all employees who are acting either individually, sometimes in trade unions. It also includes the relationship and expectations of those parties which form the social contract. So overall, the relationship and expectations of these various parties form the social contract. Different people in different countries hold differing beliefs about the role of the government, the role of employees, the role of unions, and the role of the employers. So understanding how to manage employee compensation in any specific country requires you to understand the social contract in that country. Changing employee compensation systems, for example, to make them more responsive to your customers, or to encourage innovation in quality service, or to control cost, requires changing the expectations of all parties to the social contract. The social contract, however, evolves over time. Sometimes very quickly, at other times maybe it can be taking a little bit longer. Compared to many countries, such as those in the European Union, the government has traditionally played a relatively modest role in the employment relationship. However, the role has recently greatly expanded, at least in 2 key sectors of the U.S. economy for us. So one of these key sectors is the automobile industry. Chrysler and General Motors went through a bankruptcy. And upon their exit, major shareholders were the United Auto Workers, or UAW union, in the U.S. government. And the second is the financial services, where the U.S. government played a major role in saving certain firms, either by providing funds like they did for Citibank and Goldman Sachs and Capital One and some of the others, under TARP, or the Troubled Asset Relief Program, and by actively facilitating mergers and acquisitions. You may recall the Bank of America's acquisition of Merrill Lynch, for example. Overall, keep in mind that a social contract in the United States, also known for the small role of government and the lack of tripartite relationship between government, employers, and employees, has done a rapid about face, at least in two major industries. That would be the automobile and the financial services. We also can look at the centralized versus decentralized pay settings. Perhaps the most striking example of the social contracts effect on pay systems is the degree of centralization of pay setting among countries. Companies in the United States, United Kingdom, and some Central European countries do use highly decentralized approaches with very little government involvement. In contrast, though, in Western and Northern European countries, wage bargaining is more likely to be somewhat centralized, taking place primarily at the industry or national level, with government involvement being typical in national level bargaining countries. Although understanding differences in wage bargaining levels is important, it should be also understood that things continue to evolve. Even where bargaining is primarily centralized, there's also typically bargaining at other levels as well. Likewise, there may be exceptions under particular circumstances that permit companies to deviate from the centralized agreement. So sometimes differences across countries in the degree of pay setting centralization translate, but not necessarily perfectly, into differences in wage flexibility. This type of flexibility is generally desirable to employers who do not want to be locked in to a particular wage level when product market conditions are in flux. Research shows that countries with more centralized bargaining levels, like Germany and Sweden, generally have less wage flexibility. On the other hand, countries with more decentralized bargaining, such as the United Kingdom or Czech Republic or us in the United States, generally have higher wage flexibility. With regards to regulation, we need to know that the social contract relates to the legal regulatory environment for human resource decisions in each country. The country differences in wage flexibility relate not only to the degree of bargaining centralization, but also to regulatory restrictions such as the maximum hours of work in a given week. This visual sort of helps you to see the social contracts in primary bargaining levels in European Union countries and also compare them with us here in the United States. So if you look at that centralized versus the decentralization, to what extent are companies centralized in terms of their structure or decentralized as far as their social contract goes, and also the primary level of collective wage bargaining continuum on the bottom here. So you can see the company, sector or industry based or the national approaches to it. We see here that companies that are operating in countries like Belgium, Finland, and Ireland seem to be more centralized in their approaches, and the wage or compensation decisions are made at the national level. On the other hand, several countries in the European Union like Germany, Italy, Netherlands, and Sweden, they fall somewhere in between in terms of centralized versus decentralized decision making or structure, as well as the sector and industry being involved in the decision making. So that's where you saw the examples of more German workers being on the board to decide basically the various decisions that impact them. And then finally, in terms of companies having more control and maybe somewhat being decentralized in terms of organizational structure, is us in UK. So in the United States here, you see that managers have a lot more power. So there are pros and cons associated with it. If we do allow managers to have more power, then how do we protect the workers to make sure managers are not abusing the workers? Well, in this case, managers have to realize that if they're not paying their employees fairly, sooner or later those employees will vote for unions in order to have a collective voice, so they can have a say-so, and they can have more security in terms of decisions that impact them in their livelihood in the company. So managers have to make the right decision in order to keep unions out of their organization. On the other hand, if managers are abusing their power, then obviously those employees deserve to vote for the union so they can be protected from the whims of those managers who make impulsive decisions without considering the well-being of their employees. So this model sort of gives you a good idea of international compensation challenges that you might face depending on which country you might be operating in. Another indicator of employment regulation or restriction on flexibility is the degree of legal restriction in hiring as well as firing of workers at any given time. Employers in the United States have probably more flexibility than employers in the European Union, South America, and in Japan, or even in China. As an example of how the legal framework comes into play and affects employer flexibility, consider the role of works councils in co-determination in the European environment like Germany, for example. Keep in mind that regulation has differences in wage flexibility, which also ties to regulatory restrictions. Sometimes maximum hours of work and hiring and firing of workers are determined by these regulations in each nation. The legal framework affects employers' flexibility with the role of work councils in co-determination in countries like Germany. Work councils are employee-formed and separate from the unions. The council has veto rights and rights of consent. In Europe, laws can vary within countries, and also directives apply across countries. The social contract in Europe comes at a cost. So you can see that taxes are much higher to protect workers from unemployment. A works council may be formed by employees in any business unit having 5 or more permanent employees. It operates separately from trade unions and collective bargaining process, although works councils members are often union members and may not, for example, call a strike. An employer must consult the Works Council and give it an opportunity to respond prior to taking action in the areas of compensation, as well as in a wide range of other human resources and operational areas. The Works Council has veto rights and rights of consent, which can include the right to block management decisions until an agreement is reached or a decision by the labor court is taken overruling that specific veto. The co-determination law in Germany requires that in companies which has 500 to 2,000 employees, 1/3 of the supervisory board should be employee representatives. In companies with over 2,000 employees, 1/2 of the board must be composed of employee representatives. So that is 50% of those boards being employees. By way of contrast, neither works councils or co-determination are legally required in the United States and are quite rare. So managers in the US have a lot more freedom compared to Europe and parts of Asia. In Europe, like the United States, laws can also vary within countries. Also in Europe, there are directives that actually apply across countries, such as that which is dealing with working time in the European Union nowadays. Another European Union directive gives employees the right to information in consultation on company decisions, especially in companies having 1,000 or more employees, including 150 or more in at least 2 member countries through the establishment of a European Works Council. So a company operating in multiple European Union countries might have consultation obligations with a Works Council in each country, as well as a European Works Council. The European Union has a goal of providing common labor standards in all its member countries. The purpose of standards is to avoid social dumping or the relocation of a business in a country with lower standards in labor cost. So keep in mind that we want to avoid social dumping. Unfortunately, if the right laws does not exist, it's going to increase. So the European Union is making an effort to prevent social dumping. And obviously in the United States, we have had similar laws to prevent social dumping, because we don't want all these jobs going abroad simply because their labor costs are lower or because they have lower standards. Finally, the social contract in Europe, with its regulatory and institutional limits on employer flexibility and protection of workers, comes at a cost. Also, expenditure on unemployment benefits as a percentage of gross domestic products, you can see it seems to be the highest for countries like Belgium, Italy, Netherlands, France, and obviously we are sort of toward the bottom here, and then at the lowest level you see UK and Japan. So the tax burden in countries like Germany and France is more than 60% higher than that of the United States or Canada and Australia and Japan. One purpose of these higher taxes is to help insulate workers from income losses due to unemployment. Let us talk about culture now. Culture is generally defined as shared mental programming, which is rooted in the values and the beliefs and the assumptions that are held in common by a group of people, and which actually influences how information is processed within that group or that environment, where people are collectively socialized or programmed in terms of how they see and view things. The assumption that pay systems must be designed to fit different national cultures is based on the belief that most of a country's citizens share a national character. The job of a global manager, according to this assumption, would be to define the national characteristics which influence the pay systems. So typical of this thinking is the widely used list of national cultural attributes that you're probably familiar with because it is discussed in most textbooks would be Professor Gert Hofstede's dimensions of culture with regards to how high or low the culture is in power distance, individualism versus collectivism continuum, uncertainty avoidance, masculinity versus femininity, in their long-term versus short-term orientation. Advocates of this view believe that it is crucial that companies adjust their compensation practices to the cultural specifics of a particular host country. In Malaysia and Mexico, for example, where the culture is alleged to emphasize respect for status and hierarchy, because they're high power distance, hierarchical pay structures might be more appropriate. And the same thing might be true of countries like Afghanistan, in Pakistan, and others around the globe. In low power distance countries like the Australian environment or Netherlands, for example, egalitarianism is a best approach. In companies operating in nations with supposedly collectivist cultures, such as Singapore, Japan, Israel, and Korea, should use egalitarian pay structures as well, along with equal pay increases and group-based rather than individual-based performance incentives. Employers in the more individualistic national cultures, such as our nation here in the United States, as well as United Kingdom and Hong Kong, they should use individual-based pay and performance-based pay increases. However, this type of thinking can result in stereotyping, though. The question is not what are the cultural differences among nations, rather the question should be which culture matters. Any group of people may exhibit a shared set of beliefs. Cultures may be similar or different among various categories. Let us now talk about the role of managerial autonomy in terms of international compensation. Managerial autonomy usually refers to the degree of discretion that managers have to make total compensation a strategic tool for the organization. Managerial autonomy is inversely related to the degree of centralization in regulatory intensity. Most US and UK based organizations have relatively greater freedom to change employee pay practices or even to hire and downsize than do most European companies or even companies in Japan or in China. The centralized pay setting found in European Union countries tend to limit organizations' autonomy to align pay to business strategies and changing market conditions. Now, in contrast, in countries like Singapore, the National Wage Council issues guidelines that are voluntary. So most government organizations adhere to these guides, but private firms do so at various degrees depending on whether it aligns with their overall strategies and market pressures or not. Governments and trade unions are not the only institutions to limit managerial autonomy. Corporate policies often do so as well. Compensation decisions made in the home country, corporate offices, and exported to the subunits around the world may at times align with a corporate strategy, but unfortunately discount local economic and social conditions. Overall, as the global guide depicts, international compensation is actually influenced by economic, by institutional, by organizational, and individual conditions that surround a specific department or company. Globalization really means that these conditions are changing and evolving. Therefore, international pay systems should change with it as well. We need to have a strategic market mindset. A global study of pay systems used by companies with worldwide operations identified 3 general compensation strategies: localizer, exporter, and globalizer. So these 3 approaches actually reflect the company's business strategy. In terms of the first one, localizer, in other words, think global but act local. If a localizer operates in, let's say, 150 countries, it may have 150 different systems of compensation or pay. The company's business strategy is to seek competitive advantage by providing products and services that are tailored to the local customers within that subsidiary. Localizers operate independently of corporate headquarters, so they have a lot more autonomy than perhaps the exporter. The exporter view says that headquarters knows best. Exporters are virtual opposites of localizers. Exporters design a total pay system at headquarters and export it worldwide for implementation at all locations where the company is operating. Exporting a basic system with some adjustments for national laws and regulations makes it easier to move managers and professionals among locations or countries without having to change how they are paid. However, not everyone likes the idea of simply implementing what others have designed. And then third, you have the globalizers, where you think and act globally as well as locally. Similar to exporters, globalizers seek a common system that can be used as part of the glue, in a way, to support consistency across all global locations. But here, the headquarters in the operating units are heavily networked to share ideas and knowledge. And some people believe that the globalizer is the business model for the 21st century environment. The point is that rather than emphasizing national pay systems as the key to international compensation, the 3 strategic global approaches focus first on the global business strategy and then try to adapt to the local conditions. Overall, keep in mind that we're living in a borderless world. So we should have borderless pay. This is the globalist view. Some corporations, particularly those that are attempting to become globally integrated enterprises, are actually creating cadres of globalists. These are managers who operate anywhere in the world in a borderless manner. We live in a borderless world. So should we have borderless pay? Well, look at it from a globalist point of view. Remember that globalists are managers who operate anywhere in the world in a borderless environment. Some companies are designing borderless pay systems. One testing ground is the European Union, so we shall see. Now that the United Kingdom is leaving the European Union, how will that impact the European Union? One difficulty is that base pay levels and other components depend too much on differences in each nation's laws and customs. Focusing on expatriate pay may blind some companies to the issue of appropriate pay for employees that are seeking global opportunities. There's a focus on local operations, the home country pay, and less attention to integrating operations in global firms. Commitment to the long-term global strategy can be difficult as local managers have little input and receive sometimes limited benefits. They're operating in a borderless manner to support the global flow of ideas and people. So some companies are also designing borderless or at least regionalized pay systems. One testing ground for this approach is the European Union nowadays. One difficulty with borderless pay is that the base pay levels in the other components depend too much on differences in each nation's laws and customs. So focusing on expatriate compensation may blind companies to the issue of appropriate pay for employees who are seeking global career opportunities. Ignoring these employees causes them to focus only on the local operations, their home country pay, and devote less attention to integrating operations in global firms. It is kind of naive to expect commitment to a long-term global strategy in which local managers have little input and receive limited benefits. Paradoxically, attempts to localize top management and subsidiaries may reinforce the differences in focus between local and global management. In summary, let us distinguish between nationwide and industry-wide pay determinations. In other words, how do they compare to a business strategy market approach? Well, we can say that nationwide pay determination is a highly centralized approach with significant government involvement in terms of laws and regulations. And on the other side, industry-wide pay determination is highly decentralized with little government involvement. The most powerful participants, like the companies or even the unions, typically set the pay rates. Custom, if not regulation, forces other industry members to follow suit. When wages are set based on nationwide or industry-wide patterns, compensation is not considered to be a key factor in which companies compete and differentiate themselves in order to attract employees. So they must find other ways to differentiate themselves in terms of their brand, service, and so on. For a few minutes, let us reflect about some arguments for and against typical Japanese style, typical German style, and typical US style approaches to pay. So using the global guide, what factors might be causing each approach to change? Well, we know that Japanese pay systems tend to emphasize person rather than the job. They tend to emphasize seniority and skills possessed rather than job or work performed. In promotions based upon supervisory evaluation of trainability, skill, ability levels, and performance rather than solely on performance alone. It also emphasizes internal alignment over competitors' market rates. And there's the employment security based on the performance of the organization and the individual, which was also known as lifetime security. The advantages of the Japanese approach include low turnover, high commitment, security, greater acceptance of change by employees, more predictability for companies and employees, and more flexibility. The disadvantages of the Japanese approach are the high costs which are associated with an aging workforce, failure to encourage contributors, women, and younger employees into the workplace. So those elements of discrimination that seems to be part of most cultures. In addition, the Japanese system constrains the use of pay as a strategic tool by organizations to differentiate themselves from their competitors. The German pay systems are embedded in a social partnership between business, labor, and the government. So pay decisions are highly regulated. Over 90 different laws applies to pay systems. The major employers and unions negotiate different tariff agreements like pay rates and structures for each industrial sector in Germany. Methods for job evaluation and career progression are included in the tariff agreements, which do not necessarily apply to managerial jobs in Germany. The advantages of German approach do include the provisions of generous social benefits. It supports commitment in security. It provides greater predictability for companies and employees. And companies do not compete on the basis of pay, so they have to focus on quality or service or other factors. However, there are disadvantages. So in an aging population like Japan, for example, low birth rates, earlier retirement ages, and high pension and unemployment benefits are pushing up the cost of the social support system in Germany. A relatively inflexible labor market has slowed job creation as employers are finding it easier to move to other European Union countries. So the German system is highly bureaucratic. Like the Japanese system, the German system limits the use of pay as a strategic tool by organizations. Finally, our approach in the US has several advantages. US companies possess considerable flexibility to align pay systems with their business strategies, which kind of results in greater variability among companies within and across industries, actually. So the US pay system supports performance, with costs varying based on performance. US firms encourage innovation and encourage the enormous talent and contributions that can be tapped actually from workforce diversity. The disadvantages in the US include high turnover, greater employee skepticism about change, increased uncertainty that employees are facing, in the system's short-term focus and employees' trust about continuous change and sometimes even burnout. While these scenarios do portray typical approaches to pay practice for each country that we talked about in terms of Germany or Japan or the US, variations do exist in pay practices among all companies in all countries. So the global guide depicts that the international compensation is influenced by economic, by institutional, by organizational, and by individual conditions. Globalization really means that these conditions are changing on a periodic and regular basis. Therefore, international pay systems should be changing with it as well. Let us distinguish between global workers, expatriates, local nationals, and third country nationals for a few minutes. Global workers or globalists are managers who operate anywhere in the world in a borderless world. Employees temporarily working and living in a foreign country are called expatriates or expats. Expatriates who are citizens of the employer's parent or home country and living and working in another country, such as a Japanese citizen working for Toshiba in the United States or in Canada, are called parent country nationals or PCN. Expatriates who are citizens of neither the employer's parent country nor the foreign country where they're living and working, such as a German citizen working for Toshiba in Canada, are called third country nationals, or TCNs, third country nationals. Local country nationals, are otherwise known as LCNs, are citizens of a foreign country where the parent employer operates. For example, a Canadian citizen working for Toshiba in Toronto. An additional consideration is employees' preference for international assignments usually. That could be part of the equation of compensation. For many Europeans, having international assignment outside of your country is just part of one's career. However, for us in the US, often it means leaving the action. In other words, you're leaving the headquarters, you're far away overseas, and you may lose opportunities sometimes. But nonetheless, international assignments, I think, opens up our eyes, and it provides you opportunities to rise up the hierarchy in a fair way, especially for companies that are global. Employees differ in their preferences, and they vary over time. For example, 68% of expatriates do not know what their jobs will be when they return home. 54% return to lower level jobs. Only 11% are promoted. 5% believe their company values overseas experience, so that's very low. I think the percentage should increase because that diversity of outside experience should help us to deal with cross-cultural issues more easily. 77% have less disposable income when they return home. And only 13% of expatriates are women, yet 49% are US managers and professionals. So employee preferences should be taken into consideration equitably in a fair way, so all employees are given fair chances for international assignments as well as local promotions at the headquarters. So when you're sending expatriates abroad, don't forget about them, because again, nobody else will want to go for international assignments. So we need to view international assignments as a good way to get experience, to become open-minded, and to learn other cultures' ways, which might be much more superior, and we can apply them into our home culture context as well whenever they're relevant and appropriate. So good luck designing an effective international compensation strategy for your employees, regardless of where your employees operate, whether it's in the home country, host country, or a third country subsidiary. Good luck.